Kia ora koutou, and welcome to our third seminar in our Teaching and Learning for a Sustainable World, developing our network of research and learning. I'm Sally Birdsall, and we're going to open with a karakia, and please feel free to join me. Kia hora te marino, kia whakapapa ponamo te moana. Hei huarahi mā tātou I te rangi nei, aroa atu aroha mai. Tātou ia tātou katoa, hui e, taiki e. So today, I'm my great pleasure to introduce Professor Manuel Riemer from Canada, and he's going to give his presentation, and then we'll have question time, and I'll go over the future seminars, and then we'll close. So before I hand over to Manuel, I'd like to acknowledge Ngā Ara Whetū, the Centre for Climate, Biodiversity and Society, and they are hosting our project. And we are in the process of organising the website there so that we will be able to put up these links to these seminars so you'll be able to revisit them and listen to them again, and perhaps also pass the links on to anyone else you know who would be interested. And I always have this slide up about our aim. So we're trying to develop this transdisciplinary research network where we're looking at ways that we can widen our skills, our pedagogical skills about teaching and learning for a sustainable world, and also examine the efficacy of those. And we're also looking at building collaborations across the faculties in our university and with our community and wider as well. So today, as I mentioned, we've got Professor Manuel Riemer from Canada, and he is a professor of community psychology and sustainability science at the Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada, and I've just found out that's near Toronto. And he is the director of a transdisciplinary research centre for engagement and research in sustainability. And they focus on the intersection of climate change, society, and equity. So it sounds, just what we're all interested in. And Manuel applies community psychology principles, theories, and tools, as well as systems and sustainability science to address issues related to sustainability and climate justice. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about what you do, Manuel, and I'm now going to hand over to you to begin your presentation. And thank you very much for giving up your time and coming to do this presentation for us.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm really excited about your seminar series, so happy to contribute to it. Environmental education is certainly something close to my heart. So I'm gonna share my screen here. Just give me a second. And then start the presentation. All right, can you see the screen okay? Okay, great. So my understanding was this is primarily focused kind of on sustainability education, more at the kind of university level, so that's what I speak mostly to. I wanted to start a little bit and share something about my own engagement story. How did I become engaged with this issue of sustainability and climate justice? I grew up in Germany, and sustainability was kind of just in the background. It was something that kind of happened naturally. My family was mostly biking. Recycling was already very established. We ate, from our own garden. So it was just something that I didn't really think much about as being engaged in sustainability. It was just something that was in the background. And then in 2000, I moved to Nashville, Tennessee in the US. And suddenly I realized, a lot of the things that I've taken for certain are not so. And just by simply moving to another country, my environmental footprint increased significantly. But it wasn't really until I saw the film An Inconvenient Truth with Al Gore that I felt compelled to make this a major issue that I'll focus on in my life. And I actually started working with Agor, who was located in Nashville, and was trained to give his presentation, and that really kind of was my pathway into being engaged more with this issue. Eventually, I realized it's hard to do my environmental work and also my research work at the university, and so I decided I need to combine those two. And when I was applying for a job at Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada, I had done no research on anything related to sustainability. My research focused on children mental health. But I said, from now on, I'm going to do research on sustainability. And I was just really lucky that they hired me anyway. And so that's what I've been doing ever since. And just to make a connection with where you are, I spent a few months in I think it was 2014, 15 in New Zealand, in Auckland, in Waiheke Island, working with Nikki Hare, who is on this call right now, and really enjoyed it. In fact, my partner and I, we said we could imagine retiring in New Zealand. It's such a beautiful place. Anyway, I engaged in some research with a program in Auckland, and it was really, really great. I also want to acknowledge that I live, work, and play on the traditional territory of the Nutal, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. And being located on this land is meaningful to me, and I try to take that very seriously and incorporate a lot of indigenous knowledge, both in my teaching and in my research. So I'm lucky that I have people here that share their knowledge with me. So what I'm going to cover is I'm going to talk a little bit about this perspective that I bring to this, the community psychology and systems perspective. And then I'm going to cover a little bit theory that informs the pedagogy that I do and the research that we did on this pedagogy. And then talk about some practical examples of how we applied those theoretical consideration in terms of creating engagement with sustainability and sustainability action. And then I give you a little bit of evidence to show how it worked. And if I have time left, I was a little bit ambitious with this. I'm going to talk a little bit about the current context and eco-emotions and how that plays into engagement. But we'll see how we do in time. Please keep me in check. So give me some signal that I'm getting close to the time where we should cover questions. So coming to the perspective, in community psychology, we do psychology, but we really look at individuals within their context. So to understand that the context is shaping who we are, but also that individuals, we have power to change the context, and empowering people to do so is a big part of what we do. With that, we're taking an ecological or systems view where we look at multiple layers in which people are embedded and try to understand how these complex systems are influencing us and how we can change those systems. And in this, our focus is primarily on creating social change towards well-being for all, to create conditions where everybody can thrive. And that's, of course, very close to the topic of sustainability. In the way that we work, we do what we call praxis, which is this iteration between theory, practice, and reflection. So where each of those kind of inform each other, and we constantly try to reflect on what we do. We are a value-based field. I mean, every field is value-based, but some are more explicit about it than others. And we are trying to be pretty explicit about it in terms of our social justice orientation. And when you work in sustainability, you can't really not be value-based anyway. the way we approach the work is that we work with communities rather than on communities. So we try to do participatory work where we develop the research with communities. And we do the same when we teach. I work with students to develop courses or get their input on it, make adjustments as we go. So that's just a little bit of a background so that you know where I'm coming from in what I'm going to share with you. So I'm going to cover a little bit theory. And as a kind of applied researcher, practitioner, activist, I use a lot of what's called theory knitting. So I don't just have one theory that I use, but I pull together different theories that fit together and cover, the complex phenomenon that I'm trying to engage in. And so what I'm going to do now is kind of give you some of the individual theories and then end with our theory of engagement that we have been applying for a while now. So when we talk about engagement, I find it quite useful to differentiate between kind of three dimensions of engagement, which is the cognitive dimension, the affective dimension, and the behavioral, right? The cognitive is kind of the intellectual, the knowledge, the reflection. The affective is like, is this something that I care about? Am I emotional attached to it? And then the behavior is the actual action that we're taking, or how we change our behavior or how we take action to change society. And I mention this because when you think about engagement and study engagement, you sometimes find that you might not find in any moment behavioral engagement, but people might be very emotionally engaged. And I'll come back to that later when I share some of our research. Then system thinking is kind of embedded in everything that I do. In one of our papers, we defined system thinking as a form of analysis or thought process that places emphasis on how a problem, for example, climate change, interacts in complex ways with the system in which it was created. So the economic, policy, cultural conditions. And in community psychology, we often use this ecological model, which was originally developed by Eric Bronfenbrenner in developmental psychology. But it is a really nice visual way of showing that as individuals, we have this complex context that we embedded in, and each of these layers influence each other. And so I've used this model a lot with students, and it really helps them to kind of get out of that just individual behavior mindset. And then when we think about system thinking, it's also often the question, how can we change system? How can we create transformation? Because a lot of the systems are not healthy for us. And so how can we change those systems? And here I have found it very useful, kind of, again, as a kind of a visualization of the complexity of systems, the iceberg model. You might have seen this before, but the idea is, at the surface, is what we see is the behaviors, the events, a one-off kind of thing. So for example, I, might eat something that is not sustainable, right? It's one behavior. I eat something that's not sustainable. But then underneath the surface are kind of some patterns. So I actually don't just once eat something that is not sustainable, but I continuously eat something that is not sustainable. And then I can think about it, the next layer, well, why is that, right? Well, because we are in a food system that itself is not sustainable. And I often don't have a choice. I'm part of that system. And then the question is, why do we have such system in place, right? And that goes a layer deeper, which is our mental models. It's our worldview, our beliefs that shape our systems. And the leverage theory that underlies this is the idea that the deeper that you go down the iceberg, the more significant is the change that you can create. So if we change people's mental models, then we can actually create the conditions for changing system structures, changing patterns and eventually our individual behaviors. So that is kind of the underlying theory. Here's another version of that model by Riemer and Senge that I really like, where you also see, like, to really create transformative change, we need to start with the mental models, and then we kind of can work our way up there. But really, all of these levels need to be affected somehow through our change for really transformation to happen. I'm not going to go into much more detail here just because of time, but with anything that I'm cover, I'm happy to come back to through the question period. So just let me know if you want to go deeper on this. Happy to do so. Another important concept that I draw from is action competence. This was originally developed by Jensen and Schnack and had originally 4 dimensions. The idea to be competent in engaging in action, which is always my interest, is how do we engage students in action? Is first you need to have kind of a knowledge insight. So this is, what are the causes of the problem? What are the impacts of the problem? And what are potential solutions, right? And this is where systems thinking can really help to see the deeper root causes of issues. The second is commitment. This is the motivation, the drive, the aspirations of people. And, that's kind of self-explanatory. Another really important that's often actually gets overlooked is this importance of the ability to envision an alternative future. If we think we stuck in this future that we are in this current status quo and we don't have a way out of it, it's really difficult to develop hope and to take action, because you need to believe that there is an alternative. And so engaging students in that visioning of alternatives, and I'm going to give you some examples of that today, is really critical. And then the fourth component is action experience. It's actually for students to engage in action, experience themselves as capable of engaging in action. And that creates, that self-efficacy, the belief that you can do something. And in our research, we added a 5th component, which is this kind of collective orientation, that you kind of need to look beyond yourself and have the best of the community, of the collective in mind, and as you engage, to really be motivated to not just focus on your own individual behavior or your own interests, but to go beyond that and think about the collective well-being of all. So those are kind of the 5 components of action competence as it stands today. And then from a kind of pedagogical perspective, I'm really a big fan of this idea of transformative learning, and probably a lot of you are familiar with it. It was first developed by Mesereau, and then people like O'Sullivan and Sterling kind of further developed it. But the idea here is that for students to be engaged in societal transformation, which is needed, they need to also go through an individual transformation, like a personal transformation. And for that to happen, you need to alter the learner's frame of reference, like what Mesereau calls a perspective transformation. I'm just going to quickly read this quote because I think it's really nicely explaining what that is. So it's the emancipatory process of becoming critically aware of how and why the structure of psychocultural assumption has come to constrain the way we see ourselves and our relationships, reconstituting this structure to permit a more inclusive and discriminating integration of experience and acting upon these new understandings. So we kind of constrain ourselves through the mental models that we stuck in. And if we really want to break out of that, we need to alter those kind of mental models, which is kind of here, the habits of minds and meaning scheme, which is really how we make sense of the world. Our mental models shape how we interpret our experience, how we interpret the world, and how we act in the world. And so those are very ingrained and very shaped by the culture that we're part of. whether or not it's, the capitalistic system, a neoliberal version of that, or other cultural aspects that shape the way we think. And within that is this kind of critical autonomous thinking, where you kind of move from an unconsciousness to to a consciousness, where you become aware of the world and how it works. And an effective mechanism in that is what they call a disorienting dilemma, where you confront a student with a dilemma that forces them to rethink something in a very meaningful way. I'm going to give you some. You will see when I go into the practice part, you will see some examples of that really confronted the students that we work with thinking differently, and challenging their assumptions. Am I going too fast, or is this okay? It's good? Okay. Then the last one here is self-efficacy, which probably all of you have heard before, is part of the social learning theory by Alfred Bandura. And he posted that there are, 4 ways to develop self-efficacy. So self-efficacy is the belief that you're capable of doing something. And so these 4 ways are: 1, mastery experiences. So this is where you experience yourself as actually being capable of doing something. You're doing something and you're seeing yourself, actually, I can do this. The second one is social modeling, that you see people who might be similar to you doing something. And so you see, well, if they can do it, I can probably do it as well. Like, this is possible. People are doing this. And this is where, for example, the Fridays for Future movement was so important, right? Because it showed, hey, these are young people. They're just like me, right? Like they're not, in any way too special. And they can do it, though I can do it as well, And then the social persuasion, this is really where, through encouragement and support, you give people an idea that they can actually do it. And then the last one is the states of physiology. You need to be physically in a space to actually be able to do these things. And I focus a lot on the first 2, as you will see in how we conceptualize things. So all of these different, theories that I just kind of went through pretty quickly, accumulated in our theory of engagement that we developed for a specific research project, which I will talk about in a second. And so the goal of this research project and of this theory was, how do we create action? How do we engage young people in environmental action? I was personally discouraged by a lot of the literature, especially the psychological literature, which very focused on behavior. How do we change people's behavior when so much of our behavior is shaped by societal structures? And so, isn't it better if we engage people in action to try to change those structures? And so that's where a lot of my research kind of has focused. How do we engage people in action? And by action, I like this definition by Schussler et al., like a process of co-creating environmental and social change that builds individuals' capacity for further participation, contributing to personal and community transformation. So action can be something that you take action to actually change something in your life. Like if you want to stop using a car, you might have to take some actions to actually make that happen. It's not just simply you can jump on a car, on a bicycle, and you're done, right? Like you have to figure out the routes, you have to maybe buy a bike. There's a lot of things you need to do. And the same thing with engaging other people in environmental things. So that community transformation. So there's 4 kind of components that feed into this kind of funnel of creating this change. So it's these all interacting with each other. They're not separate from each other. They work together. So it's the encouraging personal reflection. There's foster system thinking, and by now you have a sense of what I mean by that. There is building that action competence that I just went over. and providing role modeling and support. And that speaks also a little bit to that third component of self-advocacy. And if you do this effectively, then you can see kind of these mediating factors that are precursors of action, which is there needs to be motivation. You need to have a comprehension of the system that you're trying to change. If you think it's all just a bunch of individual behaviors, you might take a different approach than when you really understand what some of the root causes are. You need to have the skills, the action skills. You need to actually know how to engage people, how to maybe write a letter to a politician, those kind of things. And often those kind of skills are actually not taught in a university context. And then self-efficacy. So you need to believe that you can actually create that change, to be motivated to then take that change. And one thing that we also saw through our research is you also need to have an opportunity, especially with young people. When people have the right opportunity, they might be part of an environmental club, then they're much more likely to take action. If they're outside of an opportunity, then they're less likely to take action. And you, again, will see that a little bit in our research. How am I doing on time? Still like 10, 15 minutes or so? Okay. So let's talk about the practice. How do you now translate this? So I'm going to briefly mention the variety of approaches. I just only going to briefly mention journaling. This is something that probably a lot of you use in your teaching as well. But that really fosters that critical reflection. So if they engage in action, for example, they should be reflecting about that action. What did they learn? What did they do with them? What challenges did they run into? What is the source of those challenges? How can they overcome those challenges? And often what I do is I let the students journal on their own. They don't have to submit the actual journals. They're like their own personal reflection. But then at the end, I ask them to summarize their reflection in a final kind of assignment. And that has been really interesting for me as an instructor, because I see how they went through the process and what they learned and what they didn't learn. So I find it a really good assessment tool myself as an instructor. The second thing is visioning. I used to do an exercise which would take the whole session, where I asked them, like I put them together in groups of 4 to 5 students. I give them a kind of a board to draw on and pens, and then I ask them to close their eyes and imagine the future, the community that they want to live in 25 years from now. How does that community look like? And then they come together as a group and try to implement, their vision that they had individually. So they talk about it, what they had envisioned, why, and then try to draw that community together. And then we put up those posters and compare what people's visions were. And this has worked so consistently that people come up with the same things. It's pretty basic what people want. They want close to nature. They want to be close to the people that they love and care about. And they want it to be fun. And so then we discuss. So this is your vision. What direction are we actually heading as a society right now? Are we moving to that vision? And that is, one of those disrupting moments where they realize, yeah, no, we're not actually moving in that direction of what we all share we want. And then more recently, we went kind of digital with this, worked with students from the School of Architecture, and we created this, so we had this empty landscape here from our city. And we asked the students to think about how this could be more sustainable, and sustainability in a broader sense, not just environmental sustainability. And so they then have, all these little images that they can superimpose on that image. And so here's one example of what the students came up with. And you can see, there's solar panels, but there's also community, right? Like there's inclusion. There's people from different spheres of life. There's a vegetable garden, an urban garden, a little market. So this is a very creative process. And then we have them do these and then discuss what they put in there and why and how that relates to their vision for the future. And then also compare across different groups. So that's there's two examples of how you can do the visioning. And these have worked really well. Like the feedback that we're getting from the students is very positive and it really gets their juices going. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the others and I have like separate slides on that. So applying system thinking is, for example, I used the ecological model that I introduced earlier, and I asked them to apply that to a specific example. So if you think about recycling, what factors at these different levels, individual, the immediate social context that we're in, so our friends, family, the organizational context like our school or workplace, the communities that we're part of, and broader political context, as well as the geosphere, how do they all influence recycling? And so then they think about it, and then we kind of put that together. And if I had more time, I would have actually asked you to do this exercise, but we don't have enough time, unfortunately, for that. But here you kind of see how you map on all of these levels. And then, I actually bring in research. So research shows that the most effective ways of getting people to recycle if you provide curbside pickup. That's when we have seen 50% increase in recycling, right? So not, flyers or, all kinds of clever little individual behavior change saying, no, just create curbside recycling and then, you see a huge change. The other thing is you need to actually be able to have recyclable material, right? So that's where we go to the economic industry side of things. So this is really helpful for the students to engage that, wow, there is actually all these different levels. And so they start to think about some deeper root causes of things. And that's when we then go into what is called the problem tree. So the problem tree is where you identify a problem or an issue, let's say global climate change or increase in global climate change. And then you think about what are the primary causes of climate change, like, for example, greenhouse gases, and then what are the secondary, deeper root causes of those causes. So that is, a society that favors industrial production and unsustainable transportation and this idea of ultimate growth and those kind of things. And then you also think about impact. So you also have primary and secondary impact. So there's the immediate impact, such as change in climate, and so you have these natural catastrophes that are now becoming more frequent. And that has, of course, secondary impacts on our health, on migration, and those kind of things. So this is really a very helpful exercise that students really engage with and start to understanding system thinking. I actually just recently used that. I'm leading a collective well-being task force at our university, and we use this to identify what are the factors that impact our well-being as a collective community in our university. So the other thing is to compare worldviews, and this is kind of goes into the mental models, right? That I talked about, that kind of at the bottom of the iceberg. And here I have found it extremely helpful to compare the Christian creation story with an indigenous one. And specifically in our region here, that of the Haudenosaunee, who have the story of Sky Woman falling. And in this creation story, it is a story of a very reciprocal relationship between the first human and the animals on the planet. And so from the very beginning, you think about that reciprocity. And so with that as a philosophy, as a mindset, you do things very differently. And for students to engage with that and see that there is this alternative to the Christian creation story, which underlies a lot of our capitalistic system, um, really opens their eyes that there are alternatives, that we're not stuck in the system that we're in, that there are different ways of thinking, different worldviews that really fundamentally shape the way that we act in this world. They find that actually quite liberating, which is really interesting. And so I've used that ever since I first tried this, and it worked really well. Um, and Yeah, and it also helps with this kind of visioning of alternatives. So that's another approach. Um, then I have found to accident initially that engaging students with environmental justice is actually a very powerful way of engaging them in topics and creating these disorienting dilemmas. So in our program and in my courses ever since, we bring in an environmental justice speaker. So this is somebody who has a lived experience of environmental injustice and is fighting for justice. And then, for example, this one example here, in the Canadian context, I bring in Ada Lockridge, who is a member of the Amjawang community, just about 2 hours away from us. And they're surrounded by petrochemical plants. So here you see the red circle is her house, and all of the other dotted, the colorful dotted spots are petrochemical industry. So there's 14 different petrochemical industry surrounding this community of Ada. And there's a lot of environmental injustice that's happening in that area. It's highly polluted. And so she comes and speaks from her heart. It's a very emotional way of engaging, very, very powerful. In Bangladesh, we had a fisherman from a coastal area that was affected by a tsunami, and he talked about how even so the tsunami was coming, they were still going out to fish because they needed to put food on their plate. They were extremely poor. And so a lot of his friends died because they were on the ocean when the tsunami hit. And so that had a pretty powerful impact. And I think this might be the last. No, there's two more examples. So we did an actual exchange between students from countries who are already significantly impacted by climate change and often don't have a lot of means to address it, and then students from countries who are significantly contributing to the problem and have more means to address it. And so we connecting them through a live exchange, giving them specific questions to discuss that should talk about the action project, which I'm going to talk about in a second. And then they also have buddies, which they exchange kind of letters. And that was really powerful because one of the problems with climate change, at least in the past, was that it seemed so far away, right? It seemed like something that's happening somewhere else. And so connecting students in like countries like Canada, US, or Germany, it really opened their eyes. Yeah, like there's real people already impacted by this. And so the last example here is the action project, which is something I always do. It's very powerful in kind of creating that mastery experience. It's typically a student-led project, so they come up with what they want to do, but I often partner them with a community partner so that they're doing something that is relevant to the community partner. So the partner and the students develop together the project. And so an example in Uganda, for example, They worked with a community partner and created these really efficient wood-fired stove, because in Uganda, in the villages, they still use a lot of wood to cook. And these stoves were a lot more efficient, but they were built with local materials, so that they could build them at no cost. And so the students went out to the villages and taught people how to create these stoves, and then reflected on that in the course. Yeah, so that's kind of the last example. And now a little bit to the evidence. How am I doing on time? Should I stop so we have time for questions, or keep going for a little bit? Okay. So just quickly, so we did a big project called the Youth Leading Environmental Change Project, which happened in 6 different countries that you see here. And as I mentioned, 3 of those were impacted by climate change already significantly, and 3 were major contributors. And part of the project was to engage students in climate action, and the project had a very clear environmental justice lens. The project was co-designed by academics, local community organizations in each of these countries, and also youth leaders who were already engaged in environmental action. And it was a mixed method longitudinal comparison design. We had 365 youth participate in this, in the surveys, and we conducted 63 interviews across the 6 countries. And we learned a lot. So what we found through these different, and a lot of the practices that I shared with you were incorporated over a course of 11 sessions that we did with these students. And what we found was that they developed a stronger relationship to environmental issues. So this was kind of the short-term change. And what they shared with us a lot is that they kind of knew sustainability was something important. They should take some action, but they hadn't, right? Like it was something in the background. And so what happened through this engagement was it moved from the background to the foreground, and kind of increased the sense of importance of doing this. And they also talked a lot about that this actually created hope. That they feel like, oh, I can actually do something about this. We can do something about this. We're not stuck. And that also created the passion of actually engaging in this. I think in terms of time, I'm not going to share all the quotes. You saw that I love these quotes. They really kind of demonstrate that the things that I shared with you work. But I'm also happy to share the slides if you want to kind of read through the quotes on your own time. And then for some of the more kind of longer personal transformation that really stuck with them was this kind of perspective shift that is such an important part of transformative learning. So what they shared with us was that it kind of moved from a more cognitive thing. They talked a lot about, we talk about climate change in our courses, but it was a very intellectual engagement. And through our engagement, it became much more of an emotional issue for them. So something that they feel strongly about. It's not just an intellectual exercise. It became more real. And they also started to see more complexity. They were able to deal with the ambiguity that is in it and the complexity of all of these different issues, the different systemic root causes and all of that. So they started to see the interconnections between issues. And so that really was fostered through that system thinking. And it became more real. Like it was something that was pretty abstract to them when they started. And once they were through the program, it was more concrete and it made sense to them. And they became, of course, more actively engaged. I said it was a mixed method study, so we also developed a scale, the environmental action scale, that has now been widely used in many studies across the world. Been translated, I think, in 12 languages by now. And so we use that to kind of measure the change longitudinally. So we looked at this over a course of a year. one of the shortcomings of a lot of environmental education research that, we saw before we did the study was they only measure it at one point at a time. Like, or, maybe like at the beginning and right at the end, but they didn't follow up. And so we didn't really know how long lasting some of these impacts are. And so what we found, at the 3 months follow-up, it was still very fresh. People were highly engaged. But then it kind of leveled off almost to the level of where they started. So the red line here is the group that was engaged in the program, and the blue line is the comparison group that wasn't engaged. So we had a comparison group in each of the countries. And so we were wondering what's happening here. And so we conducted a kind of a follow-up study to see like what happened with this sustained engagement. Why isn't it more sustained? And again, there was hardly anything in the literature to tell us about it. And so we designed the study where we asked people who were environmental activists at some point to draw their engagement line. So we asked them, over time, how did you engage? What were your high points, your low points? And we asked them to label it, and then we interviewed them about their timeline. And that was really, really insightful. And one thing that we found is that, people need to be part of a community. So what they shared often, like when they left their environmental club, when they left high school, that's when their engagement dropped because they were no longer part of a community of activists. Or, when they got into university and then they started, studying this, and then they became more engaged again. So you need kind of a community. And that's really important when we work in the university context as well. How can we give them that community feeling? And then the other thing is that emotional engagement, so that they identify as an engaged citizen who cares about the environment. Because what the students told us is that there are times where it's just difficult to spend the time because they have to work on school stuff, there's competing demands, but they always, stayed emotionally engaged. Just because they weren't doing something, right, like a specific action at that time, didn't mean they were disengaged, right? They were still engaged emotionally and cognitively, just not having the time right now at that moment to engage in action. So that's something important when we think about engagement and researching engagement, that we really looking at this in those 3 dimensions and not just one. And I think I will stop here. If you're interested to talk about eco-emotions, we can see if that's part of your interest and time, but I'm aware that you have other things planned. And so I want to be respectful of that.